My name is Todd Sanders. I am an architectural historian with the Historic Preservation Division of the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. It's my great pleasure to work around the state with over 50 communities that have preservation commissions, have local historic districts, and are participants in the Certified Local Government Preservation Program, which is a joint federal, state, local preservation partnership. That's what I do. In that position, I get to travel all over the state, and I get to see great architecture and hear great stories, and I get to work with people who are really interested in the preservation of their communities, because, as I say, only your town has those buildings that tell those stories that makes you unique. There's no place else on earth like your town. So we want to make sure we keep and preserve and protect those things that make our communities unique and special that cannot be found anyplace else. I thought I would start today with a little background on Oxford, why it's here, the dates and things of that nature, and then kind of start walking around the square, pointing out some of the major architectural buildings, major elements, things that have been preserved, things that have been changed, talk a little bit about architectural technology, why certain things look the way they do, so on and so forth, and things you need to be aware of when you work on the preservation of a building and the restoration of a building, things like that. I do want to ask if anybody has a specific question as we go along. I always like to give opportunity for people to ask, because you may bring up something that we all need to hear. You may ask a question that I would have addressed if I hadn't forgotten. So please feel free to ask. That's what this is about, for the fun of learning and experiencing the square in Oxford. Well, anyway, Oxford is, of course, the county seat of Lafayette County. Lafayette County was created out of the Chickasaw Cession from the 1830s, when basically the last third of what became the present-day state of Mississippi was ceded to the government by the Chickasaw Indians. Counties then in this part of the state, big square counties, were created by the legislature. So you have counties like Marshall and Lafayette, or Lafayette as we say, DeSoto County, so on and so forth, the big square counties in the northern third of the state. As part of the legislation that created those counties, the legislature said that the seat of government should be located near the geographical center of each of these counties. So that's why you have Oxford, Holly Springs, and other cities like that near the geographical center of the county, or at least of the original 1830s counties as they were certainly originally created. And then you look at these towns, and each one of them that we just named and some others have at the center of the town the courthouse. So it's an architectural embodiment of sort of that Jacksonian democratic ideal of having it centrally located, the idea being that it was equally accessible to everyone, so that you should be able to go from any part of the county, take the same amount of time, and get to your government from that point. So that's why we have the courthouse in the middle of the town in the middle of the county, and so on and so forth. So I think that's very important to understand that, and why it's where Oxford's where it is, and all these other towns are too. Of course, the Court Square has a long history. It's very popular in the United States. It was used as the nation went west, so it's not just obviously in Mississippi or the South that has court squares, but they're throughout the Southeast and the Midwest and beyond. But it makes for a very nice town and a very nice place to walk, as you'll see in a few minutes as we begin to move. The first building I want to talk about today is the one behind us. This currently is Oxford City Hall. It was constructed in the mid-1880s as the federal courthouse and post office. If you look at the National Register District nomination for Oxford, the architectural historian who did that nomination about 30 years ago said the building was a Romanesque revival style. I'm not so sure that's what I would have called it. It looks a little too delicate, a little too elegant to be the heavy, massive Romanesque revival that I normally associate with. It certainly has the large circular, semicircular arches, but beyond that, I don't really see a whole lot of a connection with the Romanesque revival. To my mind, it's more of a Queen Anne, which was a very popular architectural style in the mid-19th century that began in England as a reaction to all of the overwrought Victorian architecture that we always think about. There was a group of architects that wanted to go back to an earlier, simpler time, and they actually focused in on the architecture of the late medieval, early Renaissance period, the Tudors, and King Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, and took a lot of that elaborate brickwork and the early simple classical styles that they were following, and then the very vernacular English classical, and melded a new architecture out of all of that, and named it for Queen Anne for some reason. I'm not quite sure why. And when it got to this country, you usually find Queen Anne architecture in large frame houses with elaborate wraparound porches and all of the turned woodwork and jigsaw work. That's our Queen Anne. But this is another interpretation of the Queen Anne with the very delicate brickwork, the nice molded brick squares with the molding around it there on either side of the arched entrance. You see all the very fine brickwork all around the arches, and the nice woodwork around the windows and the doors, all kind of, if you look at the paneling around the door, does look somewhat English-y, collegiate, sort of that period that you think about. So a very elegant building. It makes a wonderful city hall, of course, but just as a note as to where Oxford City Hall was located prior to locating here, where the current federal building is, it was built in the 70s, stood the 1938 International Style City Hall for Oxford. That was a very important, significant building in the modern style that you think about the Bauhaus and periods like architecture like that. Designed by a Mississippi architect, it was a wonderful building. But unfortunately, at the time of its demolition, it was 40 years old. People weren't thinking about it being historic. It gave way for the current federal courthouse and post office, and the city of Oxford acquired this and made this their city hall. So that's part of what I deal with a lot in preservation is, okay, what's historic? What do we save? How do we save it? What do we let go? How do we make those compromises? And it's never easy, and there's never a cookie-cutter answer. So as we walk around the square, I'm going to point out to you things that are original, why, talk about the technology, and then also mention some things that have been changed that shouldn't have been changed the way they were, maybe things that could be done to bring them back more to how they looked originally, and so on and so forth.
Can you talk about the original City Hall?
Pardon?
Are you going to talk to me more about the original City Hall?
Not at this point. That's about all. It was a wonderful white two-story flat roof building with a lot of glass block and plate glass and had a clock on the wall. It was a wonderful, I can't think of another building in Oxford quite like that.
Really.
And there aren't many in the state that survive or that were even built that were a lot like that. But it was there.
Well, it took them, our comfort is it took the people that had the demolition contract a lot of money to take it down because it was built during the the Works Depression thing, and it had concrete and steel reinforcement up to the zoo. So it could have been a bomb shelter. It was that strong.
Absolutely. And that is the one pleasure we get out sometimes with demolition is it takes a lot longer than people think to knock these old buildings down. They may look like they're about to fall in, but they very, very seldom are ready to go, and they fight a lot. And that is kind of nice to have that at the end, but it'd be so nice to have the building.
It would.
But Oxford is known and has had influence around the state with all of the balconies around the square, and we've even jokingly referred to it as the balkanization of Oxford. Yes, certainly there were historic balconies in Oxford, more like wooden two-story porches, really. They weren't all over the facades, all over the front of the buildings. They were in a few places, but certainly there has been a proliferation, if you will, of balconies around Oxford, and that's even influenced other communities in our state. When they want to revitalize their downtown, they want to put a balcony on the building. That's not always appropriate. You need to know historically if the building had a balcony. You can prove it physically with evidence that there was one. We'll try to point out some of that as we see it. Look at old photographs, look at Sanborn fire insurance maps. You can tell if a building had a balcony. And that's what we tell commissions. If it had a balcony, that's certainly appropriate to put one back. If it didn't, you better back off and really think about what you're doing. So that's been very interesting to have a Mississippi town influence other towns in Mississippi. When we first started preservation in the 1970s, everyone looked to New Orleans or Williamsburg, so you have a lot of communities with this sort of French Quarter redo or a Williamsburg brick thing, and everyone thought that was preservation. And we've since learned, no, that's not preservation. Speaking of balconies, if we will, and there are a lot of people in the way, but we're going to look at the two buildings right here. Now, I don't believe historically either one of them had a balcony. The balconies that are there certainly aren't historic anyway. They're new construction, and they really obscure and hide a lot of the architectural history of the original building. And I want to point out specifically the building on the left. You see the large display windows with the tiny little pieces of glass in there. That was something that was done a lot in the 70s. People think, oh, small paned windows, old building, historic preservation, and it looks like Williamsburg. But that is not historically appropriate for Oxford, not for a building of that period. We talked about Oxford being established first in the 1830s. Well, I'm sure you've all heard that in the Civil War it was pretty much burned to the ground, so the earliest buildings of Oxford, including the courthouse, were gone. So all of the buildings that you see, with the possible exception of parts of one, are from the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. And in that period, there was a big change in building technology that greatly affected the way buildings, especially commercial buildings, looked. And those three developments were plate glass, cast iron, and pressed metal. And we'll point out some of that as we go around. But now I think this is probably a good time to kind of walk this way, and in front of the First National Bank, we're going to look at the courthouse, talk about it,